Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this online WES Talk organised by John Wesley's New Room, Bristol, in partnership with the Methodist Church's Learning Network Southwest. John Wesley's New Room is the oldest Methodist building in the world. Situated in Bristol city centre, John Wesley called the chapel a light in the city and used it as a base for his work. In 2017, a new visitor centre opened on the site, which features a new revamped museum, cafe, shop, library and meeting rooms. My name's Mandy Briggs and I'm the Education Officer. Behind the scenes is my colleague Louise Ratton, who will be heading up the technical side of the talk tonight. Please note that this talk is being recorded. During the talk, you will be able to hear and see our panellists as they talk to each other, but your own video and audio will be turned off. If you have particular questions that you would like to ask the panel, please save them for the question time towards the end of the hour that we're spending together, when we will ask you to write the questions into the Q&A facility, not the chat. You can access this by clicking Q&A at the bottom of the screen. I wonder if we can bring in our speakers, please. Hi there, Hannah. And hello, Noel. Welcome to WES Talks.
Hello, thank you.
Our WES Talk series aims to explore life and faith in today's world. This weekend marks the start of the COP26 summit on climate change. Politicians, protesters, climate experts and campaigners will be meeting in Glasgow for talks which will hopefully result in important decisions about our world and how we care for it. But why does COP26 matter, and why should people of faith be taking notice? I'm going to, in a couple of moments, hand over to first Noel and then Hannah, who are going to talk to us tonight about why COP26 matters. But first of all, I'm going to embarrass both of you by sharing a little bit about each of you as we welcome you to WES Talks. Rev Noel Sharp has served as a Methodist minister in Walsall, Redditch and Gloucestershire. He worked part-time as the regional coordinator for Christian Aid for Gloucestershire for 7 years. Wherever Noel has been, he has been involved with local community, peace and justice groups, and alongside others has initiated the Redditch Trade Justice Network, Transition Gloucester and Greening Tetbury. He has led and supported memorials to the Methodist Conference and has been part of the group successfully seeking to get the Methodist Church to divest from fossil fuels. Noel comes from Leicester, is married and has 3 grown-up children. After doing a psychology degree and before being a minister, he was a chaplain at Wolverhampton Polytechnic, worked as a care assistant with the elderly and as a residential social worker. Noel and his wife Elaine are walking the southwest coast path very slowly, it says. Noel has kept chickens and likes swimming in the sea. Thank you, Noel, for those bits of information. Hannah Brown is the Campaigns and Church Engagement Officer for the Joint Public Issues team known as JPIT. Her role involves ensuring that JPIT's campaigns are run effectively and helping to empower local churches to engage with social justice and effective change making. Hannah has a background in local church partnership and engagement and enjoys exploring how we communicate for effective change. She is particularly excited to see how JPIT can empower the church to be a voice of hope and transformation, particularly for those marginalised and disempowered by the systems of society. Thank you both once again for joining us this evening. I believe that Noel is going to speak first. So Noel, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mandy. Thank you for the invitation to come. It's great to be here today. Let's just start in a little bit of background as to why we're here and why we're doing this. A little bit of history about COP. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992, established an international environmental treaty to combat dangerous human interference with the climate system by stabilising greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. And it called for ongoing research, further work, meetings, negotiations, and treaties. It was signed then by 154 states. Arising from this, there was the Kyoto Protocol, signed in 1997, which ran from 2005 to 2020. There were three different categories of states within this. Annex A were the developed countries, Annex B were some kind of in-between ones, and Annex 3 were the developing countries. Each country is put in a slightly different condition, dependent upon how, I guess, developed they were, how much they'd contributed to climate change, and how much they were suffering from it. The Kyoto Protocol was superseded by the Paris Agreement, which came into force in 2016. And as of 2020, this United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has 197 signatories. That's the treaty part of it. And that overseeing and kind of supervising the management and the running of the treaty is the COP, the Conference of Parties. Now, there are international conference of parties on all kinds of different matters. They're composed of state parties and observers and activists. And there are COPs for chemical weapons, for organic pollutants, for desertification, and there's a recent one on biodiversity. So the Conference of Parties tries to put the treaty into action, oversees its progress, and it started to agree the nationally determined contributions for each state. So the amount of carbon that each state would promise and commit to cutting. The first COP in Berlin, 1995, and they've been held every year since, except 2020. So this year's one has been delayed. And the UK, as you'll know, is hosting the 26th UN Climate Change Conference of the Parties in Glasgow from October 31st into November. And it's chaired by the UK. The COP president is Alok Sharma, and there will be 190 world leaders there, co-hosted with Italy. Is there delegates, heads of state, climate experts and negotiators will be there, and people from civil society. Those who promised to be there are Prime Minister Johnson, President Biden, Macron, Modi, Bolsonaro, Attenborough, Greta Thunberg. I'm not quite sure. I think some doubt, I don't know if people have heard more recent things than me of whether the Chinese leader Xi Jinping is going to be there or not. I think there's some doubt maybe he isn't going to be there. There'll be about 200 countries represented and 30,000 people. I don't think it's hard to imagine in the outer edges of it how many people are going to be descending on Glasgow. Why is it important? Just three things very quickly. This is the first time since the Paris Agreement that the countries will commit to increasing their NDCs, have you remembered? Nationally determined contributions. It marks the return of the US to the table. It's very significant. You want all the significant players to be there. US was mysteriously absent recently. I wonder why, but it's now going to be present again. It will address unresolved issues from Paris and renew the international effort. One person said, this is the most important COP since the Paris Agreement. This conference is the best and only platform to build consensus on climate justice and action. I'm now going to share my screen and to share a bit of what actions can we expect or aim for. So I hope you can see that. What actions can we expect or aim for from COP? What will they be talking about? Well, to try to secure global net zero emissions by 2050, to keep the global temperature increase to only, or as close as we can, to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, to keep that within reach. We'll also need, many people are saying, firm goals and targets. And programs for 2030. We need not just to set it at 2050, but to get the way markers, the cairns in the journey, if you like, along the way. We need to improve the nationally determined contributions. We'll need to accelerate the end of coal as an energy source, to speed up the switch to electric vehicles and speed up the switch to investment in renewables. Secondly, to adapt to protect communities and natural habitats, to avoid loss of homes, livelihoods and species, which of course is already happening, to help mitigate the already effects of climate change on many communities throughout the world. Work together to deliver detailed policies to make the Paris Agreement operational. It'll take greater cooperation of public, governments, business. It'll make a new big coalition of coalitions. I'll tell a bit about that later. And fourthly, to deliver the globalised finance necessary to make all these things happen. In 2009, there was a commitment made to provide developing countries, the next 3 countries, with $100 billion per year to combat climate change. And we need to honour that commitment this year and every year, and not just governments, but also to banks, international financiers to play their part. And as someone has said, that sounds a lot. $100 billion is a heck of a lot of money. That sounds a lot, but it is a bargain given the existential threat we face. The cost of not acting is just astronomical, both in financial terms and, of course, in human and biodiversity and social terms as well. There is a bit more about the money, but maybe we could come back to that later. Yes, there's a little bit about why we should be involved in it. I think on the whole, Christians have been committed to personal spirituality and to charitable deeds, but not so much, I think, to getting really politically engaged. We tend to have been scared of it or held at arm's length, or been neutral in issues of big politics. And we all know what being neutral means. It means siding with the status quo, what is already happening. And I think the church needs to get off the fence with this on matters of weapon and tax and climate. We don't like ideology on the whole. I did a bit about Jesus' ideology for this and recorded it into my phone. And even my phone didn't like it. It recorded Jesus' ideology as Jesus' ideal belly. It's not the same thing at all. Jesus was killed for his political ideology, not for loving his neighbour, not for healing the sick, not for feeding the hungry, but for declaring the kingly rule of God, gathering disciples, building a movement, creating a body of people, saying there'd be a year of jubilee, saying how difficult it would be for the rich to enter the kingdom, that the last will be first, the first will be last, the poor were blessed and would inherit the kingdom, and the rich would be sent empty away. It was Jesus' whole social, spiritual, faithful, prayerful, political worldview, his whole ideology and his politics that got him into trouble with the Sanhedrin and Pilate. If we are to be followers of Jesus, we need to integrate our life, our faith, and our politics, and to dare to get our hands dirty with the nitty-gritty of the political world too, to counter ideologies that currently rule the world and the way decisions are made. I think the climate emergency is a battle for the ages, a task which should unite humanity. As all people from around the globe are gathering at COP26, that should be a symbol of a uniting human race, getting around the big common problem. We ought to live as if there is enemy invasion in the the sci-fi films. The thing that unites the world is an attack from the Martians. You know, it's some other outside force that brings the countries together that will destroy the Earth. The battle by climate change should and must be at the moment as a global international movement of movement, symbolised by COP26. Gathering of all those who love the earth, who love the birds and the bees, who sail in the oceans and fish in them, who climb the mountains, who grow food in our soils, who live in our cities and villages, who seek to feed the hungry, who run our businesses, who run our education, who are involved in health, who transport goods, who work in energy companies, from Brazil to China, to the United States, to Australia, to Malawi, to Peru, to Mozambique, to the Philippines. Those of some faith and no faith and any faith, Christian, Muslim, Hindu. We need every hand on deck in this battle. The crisis is so severe. It should be a battle for the ages that unites the human race, helps us to work together so that all of us can survive and maybe one day thrive again. We are on a boat that is sinking, and we need every hand on deck bailing out and helping to create the new world. It's not happening in a vacuum. In a world which is waking up with all kinds of wonderful kinds of community involvement, experiments in ecological and communal living, symbolic actions, prayers, new movements, the community that's growing on the island of Egg and how they're providing their own energy. Because the people of the world shape the culture and enable the leaders at the top of COP to take practical action. Politicians sometimes only act if they are really forced to by the weight of human energy. We need to counteract those who don't want action to take place. The power of inaction of the deniers, of the millions of money that's put into PR by fossil fuel companies and still is done so to limit action and to say why we shouldn't do things. But there are 1,000 signs of hope in the big battle of our lifetime and of our species. And I will just share one or two of those and share a screen again of the many ways in which people are getting involved on the ground. It's just a sprinkling of them. We were glad, I live in Stroud, to welcome a couple of people who'd walked up from Bristol and from further south in England on the Camino to COP. Which was people walking from Bristol and from around the country to Glasgow. We hosted two people, Mikey and Diana, who have been walking 17, 20 miles a day, sleeping on church floors. One of the walkers, Sarah, said, "The climate emergency is so frightening. Changes that are needed for our survival seem so complicated and confusing. Walking the Camino keeps me in touch with the essential simplicity of it all. We turn towards the place we need to reach. We keep putting one foot in front of the other until we get there, learning from and sharing with everyone we meet along the way. That is how we will reach Glasgow. That is how we can reach net zero. For me, walking the Camino is an act of connection, inspiration, and hope." I thank God for those who are walking the Camino. I used to work for Christian Aid, as Mandy said, and the Christian Aid action movement called To Rise to the Moment. They say we must underpin all that we do in prayer and action in the pilgrimage for climate justice. We can help amplify the calls of people from around the world for change by creating a prayer boat, and inviting people, you may have heard, to make origami prayer boat, to write a prayer on it, and then to send that to their elected MPs or representative as a way of showing their commitment and demand for real action to happen at the climate talks. You may have come across the beautiful Quaker project, Loving Earth project, creating a number of textile panels to celebrate people, places, creatures, and other things that we love, which are threatened by the growing environmental breakdown. And there's some pictures of polar bears and children, people protesting, Save Our Planet, school strikes, Save Our Future. And more recently, the news of those creative initiatives from around the world in the Earthshot Prize. And one of the stories was of the Reedy energy capsules. Nigeria, Reedy capsules, solar, powered energy firm created capsules which make electricity affordable and accessible in poor communities and can be rented for 50 cents a day. There are all kinds of wonderful projects and people getting on board in the fight. And these are significant. And what's going on in COP, in a way, is will be enabled, empowered to do more because of the uprising of your and my voices and the voices of those throughout the world. Cristina Figueras, the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, who picked up the reins after the failure of the 2015 COP in Copenhagen and rebuilt the movement for the successful COP in 2016. He spoke to some of the people who were walking from Gloucester, where I lived then, and she said to them, "Thank you for walking to Paris from Gloucester. I know much of it was thankless. Much of it you felt a small group alone in the wind and the rain. You've got sore feet. You were sleeping often on uncomfortable floors. Without your action and witness, the result of Paris would not have been possible." I believe that not just as an act of faith, but as something that is profoundly true, that each of us shapes the culture, the political temperature. We create the atmosphere in which politicians can operate. And it's so essential that every step, making an origami boat, to making a cloth panel, to saying our prayer, to holding our vigils, to doing our marches, to meeting with our MPs. Every hand on deck is necessary, and every means we have of class revision and of activity and of protest. Francis said, and I'm nearly there, that from God's hands we have received a garden. We cannot leave a desert to our children. We must all work together within our own culture, experience, initiatives and strengths, so that our Mother Earth may be restored to her original beauty, and creation may once again shine according to God's plan. Now, Mandy Louise, that feels like about my time. I have a bit about Methodism I could do now or I could do later.
Thank you, Noel. Let's save that for later and hand over to Hannah. Thank you for now.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noel. That was a really helpful kind of overview and background of where this next week and fortnight sits in the kind of wider picture. And I'm sure we'd love to hear a bit about Methodism later. So please do bring that back in. Thank you so much for having me this evening. Just a bit of background for who the Joint Public Issues Team, or JPIT, are. JPIT is 4 church denominations working together on issues of peace and justice. So we are the Methodist Church, the United Reformed Church, the Baptist Union, and the Church of Scotland, working together to bring a united voice, particularly around political advocacy, in bringing the voice of the church into the public square on issues such as climate change, to raise a distinctively Christian, but also often a multi-faith voice around what we believe just change to look like. And that's some of the work we've been doing in the lead up to COP26. And it's been part of a much longer history for us in terms of campaigning around environmental issues. And I'm sure for many people who've been campaigning on COP, this has felt like one step on a long journey. We haven't always got it right as churches. We have grappled ourselves with what it means to be responsible in terms of our relationship with creation and the actions we take around our resources. But this year, in the lead up to COP, we've particularly been exploring how we can bring our voice as churches into the civil society movement for a successful COP. And as we've approached COP26, our work as churches has focused on 2 levels, what we would call transformation and advocacy. We wanted to be asking 2 questions, really. First of all, how might the church's engagement with COP26 through advocacy change the outcomes of the conference itself? And how might the engagement of the churches with COP26 transform our work and our lives as churches in terms of working towards climate justice? Not just how might we influence, but how might we be influenced by engagement in this moment? And so that's what I wanted to explore with you this evening briefly, using some examples of what churches have been doing, talking to you a little bit about some of the advocacy work we've been focusing on, and that we will particularly be speaking loudly about over the next fortnight during COP26. I will just share my screen with you. So beginning with advocacy, what would make COP26 a success, and how might churches be able to shape this? This was our starting point as we approached COP26, and there are lots of different opinions about this, some of which Noel has already shared. JPIT's churches have primarily approached COP26 collaboratively, working with other Christian organisations and multi-faith groups. We recognise that this is a really important opportunity that demands a strong and powerful voice from faith groups towards government, and that's best done when working in alignment with others. So, for example, we've particularly been working with a group called Faith for the Climate, a multi-faith group of denominations, faith groups and organisations to present that united voice on key issues. We felt that this year in particular, working interfaith has been really important in terms of the power of our advocacy, as we've found the government to be much more responsive when we've come as an interfaith group rather than as a single faith group around advocacy issues. And seen that there's really been strength in offering a united moral voice in these conversations, in reminding people that responding to the climate crisis is more than a financial or a practical issue, but is a social and spiritual one as well. So as we've approached COP, we've reflected on what our key issues might be to raise our voices around, working within that key framework that Noel was discussing, of action which keeps global warming below 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels and helps countries work towards those net zero commitments that have been set under the NDCs, as well as dealing with the consequences of climate change, particularly in the global south. And within this, we wanted to ask, what is a distinctively Christian or faith voice here? What is it that we can bring as faith groups that might not already be part of the conversation? How can we add something different to this space? And we recognise that as people of faith, we're not just looking for changes for our climate, but for climate justice, a response to the climate crisis which embodies the principles of justice that we see reflected in God's character, where the weak are lifted up, where the mighty are cast down from their thrones, and everyone is enabled to flourish. So we've wanted to hold the advocacy aspects that we've been prioritising against these characteristics. Are we truly seeking climate justice through what we're calling for? And this has shaped the advocacy that we've prioritised. It's helped us to kind of narrow down what could be a whole range of asks into headlines that we really wanted to be loud about around COP26. And within another context as well, the UK has two roles this year at the COP. As a nation represented in the COP, in the Conference of Parties as the UK, but also as host and president of the COP in terms of shaping the global movement towards a successful outcome from this conference. So as UK citizens, our elected representatives hold that dual role this year, and we therefore get that dual opportunity to influence. And we've wanted to take that really seriously and make the most of that opportunity. So we've focused our advocacy around both of those spaces, what the UK needs to do in and of itself as a nation to meet its own targets, but also how the UK can be using that power as host and president of the COP to influence the conversation. So starting us off around kind of what the UK can do in particular. Quite a lot has moved on in terms of UK policy around COP and around climate since it was announced that the UK would be host. I think they've really felt that pressure to be seen as leaders, whether they are actually leading or not is another question, but particularly to be seen as leaders in the climate space as they've hosted the COP. You know, examples might be recent announcements around funding for home heating, or last year the UK's 10-point plan they released in terms of working towards net zero. We've seen the government make a number of commitments over the last year in particular but we haven't necessarily seen these backed up with substantial action. So we've particularly focused our campaigning around asking the UK to do two things: to set targets for net zero, as well as outlining plans to meet interim goals. So we're calling on the UK to close that gap between pledges and policy initiatives by announcing things like new finance for transition initiatives, much like the heating funding that was announced earlier in the month, announcing more support for local governments to transition to net zero, and to making serious moves away from fossil fuels through moving investment, through changing subsidies for the fossil fuel industry, and for changing transport options, for example. We need the government to be both honest and accountable to their actions, to match up to the commitments that they're making. And Noel talked a little bit about those kind of way markers that we're calling for on our journey to net zero. We're looking for the government to set interim targets of at least every 5 years between now and their net zero goals, so that they can be measured against that regularly and held accountable to making tangible changes that will help them meet commitments. And within that context, we are particularly in the context of COP26 calling on the government to end all use of public money to subsidise fossil fuels. Since the Paris Agreement was signed back in 2015, 3.875 billion of UK public funding has supported fossil fuel projects overseas, usually in the form of fossil fuel subsidies. And that's any government action which lowers the cost of fossil fuel energy production, raises the price received by energy producers, or lowers the price paid by energy consumers. We know enough about fossil fuels by now to make a responsible decision around their use and to know the consequences when we don't. It's not right that we continue subsidising an industry which contributes towards climate-related damage, whilst claiming to be committed to net zero. So it's important that this money is not only moved away from the fossil fuel industry, but also that we identify better ways that this money can be spent, not to prop up an industry that is ultimately failing, but to move towards a just transition to net zero, where we invest in sustainable energy transition, where we support training for jobs in new industries, and where we contribute towards mitigation efforts in countries overseas who are on the front lines of the climate crisis. Fossil fuel subsidies make it cheap to pollute, and they disregard the impacts on communities around the world, and we need to see that change if the UK is going to be serious about its commitments. In December 2020, the UK government finally announced it would end direct government support for fossil fuel energy sectors overseas. But now we need them to go further, including doing things like undergoing a peer review of its financial support for fossil fuels and ending tax relief for oil and gas extraction here in the UK. So those are two really key things that we're looking for the UK to do as a nation in the context of COP, to match up that gap between kind of pledges and policies, and to be both honest and accountable in terms of the commitments they're making towards net zero. So what about the UK as host and president of the COP? So the UK will play a key role in shaping conversation at COP26, and we want to be strategic in how we influence this as faith groups. We've got that key aim, as I outlined earlier, of supporting ambitious national pledges, or NDCs, from across the world at COP26, and helping countries renew those commitments made in Paris in 2015. We want to see things like the US making a more ambitious goal, China making a more ambitious goal towards net zero, that's better than where they are now, alongside other nations doing similar to the UK and committing to those interim targets of every 5 years. And as host, the UK gets that opportunity to shape the conversation, to push for it in negotiations. And we're calling on them to use that opportunity to really push what COP will achieve in its fortnight of negotiations. But alongside that, a really key focus for us this year has been around something called loss and damage. Loss and damage relates to damage already being done by the climate crisis, which we're often all too aware of in terms of our relationship with partner churches overseas. For example, those partner churches on the front lines in Fiji, or other countries that are feeling the consequences of the climate change now, not just possibly in the future. Whilst we need to rapidly cut emissions and put resources into adaptation around climate impacts, there are some consequences which no one can adapt to. These are known as loss and damage, including examples such as sea level rise, severe extreme weather events like cyclones. Loss and damage has been on the agenda at COPs for a number of years, but it hasn't made significant progress. At COP26, we're asking for significant effort to be made to secure new and additional sources of finance to fund support for climate-related loss and damage. An example of this is Cyclone Idai, which killed more than 1,000 people, left more than 400,000 homeless, and destroyed 700,000 hectares of crops in Mozambique in 2019. But in that moment, international fundraising didn't bring in enough support, and Mozambique was forced to borrow from international institutions, leaving them, like many others, trapped in a spiral of debt to respond to a disaster that was completely outside of their control. This can't be the case, and it is unjust that countries on the front lines who often haven't borne the most responsibility for climate change aren't funded properly to deal with the consequences. Loss and damage also refers to non-economic losses that you just can't put a price on. Things like biodiversity loss, cultural loss, loss of sacred lands. Efforts must be made to ensure that communities are compensated for these invaluable losses. This has been a real issue for COPs in the past, as it often brings to the fore the inherent inequalities of the climate crisis. In the UK, the context of cuts to international aid make the need for this kind of funding even more urgent. It is an issue of justice. Rich countries who have built wealth on fossil fuels owe a moral debt to those who are now bearing the brunt of the climate crisis. So in Glasgow in a couple of weeks' time, we need to see new and renewed commitments to put up funding to help finance support for climate-related loss and damage. We're looking for a global climate fund of at least £75 billion, commitment of climate finance each year. This doesn't necessarily have to come from national budgets. We need to build a fund for loss and damage that uses innovative financing mechanisms to fast-track the growth of that fund. For example, through things like a global tax on fossil fuel extraction, or through cancelling the debts of poorer countries to help free up funds. It's important that this kind of funding always follows the polluter pays principle, that the funding comes from those who have caused the problem and is directed towards those who bear the consequences most heavily. Finally, around the COP, we're calling on the government to be really taking key steps to make the COP inclusive. COP26, like any global summit, is already biased and unbalanced towards Western countries. COVID has made this even harder with vaccine inequalities and travel inequalities. We have to ensure that this COP gives everybody a seat at the table, particularly that voices from the Global South are not only present in the room, but are given a platform and influence in decision making, which does affect them. So we're calling really for the UK government to use their role as host to shape the COP to deliver mechanisms that support the needs and demands of the Global South in particular, who are on the front lines of the climate crisis, and recognise the inequality that often countries in the global north have benefited the most from climate change and now should pay more to address the consequences. So that's kind of a whistle-stop tour around the advocacy work that churches have been doing, how we're bringing a faith voice into those spaces that really emphasises climate justice rather than just action to tackle climate change. But I mentioned at the beginning that that we also wanted to focus on how our churches might be changed by engagement with this conference. It's really important that we remember that COP26 and a meeting of world leaders for a fortnight in Glasgow isn't the be-all and end-all of a response to the climate crisis. Whilst it's absolutely essential that global leaders take action, They don't hold all the power in this context. This has to be a whole society approach, which sees everyone play their part in transition to a net zero society, where we both understand and respect the impact of our actions on the lives of others in relation to the environment. So as I asked at the beginning, how might we both shape this conference, but also how might this conference being held in the UK transform us as churches? We've felt that COP26 happening in the UK has been a huge opportunity to draw focused attention in the churches to the climate crisis and the responsibility of our churches individually to act. We have to think about COP26 as a springboard rather than as a finishing line, a chance for us to build momentum that starts this decade as one where substantial climate action takes place across society. And I want to illustrate how this has been happening with a couple of examples across the UK, and they really build on what Noel was saying through things like the Camino earlier, those moments of individual and collective action that people of faith have been taking in the lead up to COP. So first of all, Climate Sunday. Climate Sunday has been the largest ecumenical initiative ahead of COP26, encouraging churches to take action on climate for the first time or to take the next step for their community. It's asked churches to do three things: to hold a climate service, focusing in worship on our relation to creation as people of faith, to commit to action, investing time and energy in a greening scheme such as Eco-Church, where the church community can go on a journey with their relationship to the environment, which will long outlast COP26. And finally, to speak up, to add their voice to the voice of others calling in the UK on the government to take action at COP26. So Climate Sunday has seen over 30 organisations and denominations come together to build this movement, and over 2,000 churches registering Climate Sunday services. The goal of that movement has been to build momentum in the church for long-term impact, to be a catalyst to move the churches forward in both understanding, in faith and in action. Another example is the work of the Young Christian Climate Network and their relay named Rise to the Moment. The Young Christian Climate Network relay has passed through the UK as groups of young people and people supporting them from intergenerational groups have walked all the way from the G7 in Cornwall to COP26 in Glasgow. They've stopped in towns and cities along the way and have been hosted by churches, opening up conversations about our role as people of faith on the journey to net zero. This has been a brilliant example of young people leading the movement within the church towards climate change. And it's been a really imaginative exercise that's really unlocked a lot of creativity in people, that's helped capture people's heads as well as their hearts in this conversation around COP. And it's used this moment to spark a conversation within our church communities about the role that we play in moving towards net zero. And last but not least, Climate Justice for All is another project that's done something similar. Climate Justice for All has been an international group of young Methodists from 5 countries, bringing voices and stories from around the world together for the Methodist Church to listen and to learn, to commit to changes in their own context and to speak up again ahead of COP26. Together in this small group and in a wider group of volunteers, Climate Justice for All have learnt from one another, and they've built a campaign encouraging Methodists to take action for climate justice. They've held art groups in Uruguay, they've run flash mobs in Italy, and they've presented to the government in Fiji. And they'll all be present in Glasgow, holding a live stream service on Saturday the 6th and Sunday the 7th of November across different time zones, where they'll be celebrating everything that's been done by that campaign over the last year and everything that's still to come as well. In Britain, the 2 COP workers based here coordinated a letter to Alok Sharma, which has so far received over 1,700 signatories from Methodists in Britain. The letter is actually open to sign until midnight tonight. So if it's not something you've done yet, I'll put the link in the chat. And you can sign that letter to add your voice to a movement of Methodist members across Britain calling on Alok Sharma to make the COP a success. So across projects like this, we want to see the legacy of this year, of this COP in the UK, having consequences for decades to come in our churches, and hope that these initiatives have played a part in that too. So just to wrap up, I think it's not helpful to understate the importance of COP26. It is a crucial moment in global action to ensure that we do everything we can to respond to the climate crisis. Faith voices must be a part of this, must be a part of keeping up pressure on government to do everything that they can in this moment and in future years too. But we also have to set this in a wider context. COP26 is not the end goal. Previous COPs, particularly, for example, the COP in Copenhagen, have been a bit of a cliff edge for campaigners, where the energy has been drained from civil society as the COP has failed in its targets. You might have seen today that the Prime Minister and others have already started expressing concerns that the COP isn't going to achieve everything that it needs to, and pushing back those deadlines that should have been met by this year. So it's important that we recognise that whilst we need to keep up the pressure, this isn't the be-all and end-all. We have to be hopeful that the conversation that this has sparked in local communities, in local churches, broadens out the legacy of this COP to beyond the policy agreements that are made in that room over the fortnight, that mean that we've laid a strong foundation for years to come to enable proper and significant change to come for the climate crisis. So I think it's really important that we hold both of those things in our mind as we approach the next fortnight in Glasgow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hannah. And thank you also to Noel. Thank you for both of your contributions. There's a lot to think about. And I hope that for us all as attendees, that's been a really good introduction to COP26. I think it's really important to recognise that it isn't the be-all and end-all, that it's not like a full stop after the next 2 weeks, that everything continues after that. So we've got about 10 minutes left, and I would be really interested to get some questions now from our attendees. If you're an attendee and you'd like to ask a question, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and type your question in there, and we will attempt to answer them. Well, I won't attempt that. I'll give it to Hannah and Noel to answer. But while we wait for people to ask their questions, Noel, you were saying that you maybe wanted to say a little bit more about the Methodist perspective, and I don't know whether you want to come back and add some of that now.
Just a bit about local. I don't know how many people who are here from the Bristol Methodist district. There is a Bristol Methodist Eco District team that gathers people from each of the circuits in the district to encourage churches in each of the circuits. I think if there's one thing a church can do, it's a spark for everything else. It is doing the Eco Church survey. If you do the Eco Church survey, that'll ask you questions about your use of land, about your teaching in the church, about use of property, about your lifestyles, and that it prompts you lots of things that maybe you hadn't thought of before. Oh yes, I mean, is our boiler an efficient one? Are we leaving wild spaces on our graveyards? We use a different energy supplier. Have we twinned our toilets? Are there places to park bicycles? All those kind of things. So I think the eco church is the big thing that churches should try to get into. And I think there's a group we're beginning to ask, what can we do as a district? Because I really think we should use our connectionalism. There are 200 churches about in the Bristol district. And if we got together, we might be able to have a bit of kind of purchasing power for having for organising for there to be sustainable energy supplied to the churches, or we could arrange for there to be electrical vehicle charging points on the manses, or maybe in the church car park. There's lots of potential for the plant that we've got, and if we do things in a connected way, that might enable to get some what do you call it, quantities. You know, you increase the quantity, then you make something cheaper for everybody together. So I think, yeah, to use our connectionalism as circuits and districts, and maybe even connectionally, it's good to have that contact with JPIT that's working across Methodism and more broadly across ecumenically too.
Thank you, Noel. So we do have a question that has come in, and this is from Sue. Well, this is a really good question. So I wonder if Hannah, you want to have a think about it, and also Noel. There's so much that needs addressing. What's the single most important thing we can or should do as individuals? So just a small question, really. Do either of you have any thoughts on that question? And thank you, Sue, for asking it.
I think that's a very hard question. So it's a good one to kick us off with. You might have seen today that the Prime Minister's actually been making some comments around things like this. He said to a group of 8 to 12-year-olds that recycling was not very useful, and that we should be using less plastic. That sparked an interesting conversation online about what the most useful thing that people can do is. So in kind of a statistical sense, I think I can give you an example of some research that was done by the University of Leeds, actually, that says one of the biggest things that you can do is live without a car, or use an electric car instead, followed by cutting out long haul flights. So those are two really practical examples of some studies that have been done that make an example there. But I think it's really important that we recognise that decision is not going to be the same for everyone. That actually it's a personal thing, but it's also a collective thing. And the decisions that we can make in our community context, in our church context, as well as in our kind of family homes, are going to differ for everybody. But the important thing is that we're making them considerately, that we're reflecting on what's in our power, and that perhaps we're pushing ourselves to go one step beyond what might feel comfortable, not just sticking with what's in our immediate mindset. So yeah, it's there's probably not a one-size-fits-all answer, which isn't very helpful, but that example from the University of Leeds is living without a car.
Noel, would you like to chip in?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we need to do the little things, but we need to do the big things as well. And I think the big things are limiting our own flying, are eating less meat and dairy, and in using cars less. So similar things to what Hannah has said. And I think we're on a journey with that, and it's not about whipping ourselves or whipping other people, but recognising we need to make personally the big steps too. And Christian life is, I drift into using that word. I mean, I was going to say sacrifice, but I think it is letting go of some things. I think actually it's joyful entry into many more things. And one thing for the church is to do the eco-church thing, and one thing is join a group that is going to do it with you, whether it's a church group or get 2 or 3 people chatting around the coffee bar and get them to do it with you. Join your local transition group or climate change group, whatever it is, because then you're energized by other people and you're not alone. And it needs community-based solution. I mean, at Tetbury, where I'm the minister, we held one meeting. We showed a film in a local, the churches generated it. We showed the Al Gore film, Inconvenient Truths, and about 150 people came from Tetbury, and from that we launched a group. And from that, there's been an ongoing group. It's done a lot of other things. So try to be the spark that lets the flame grow.
Thank you, Noel. I believe earlier when you sent me some notes about what you were going to say, you talked about getting churches getting their hands dirty. Is that the sort of phrase, that sort of thing you mean?
I suppose I meant that both literally and figuratively. Really, is that being involved with local communities, with local other transition groups, greening groups, and meeting with those who might not be your allies too, or might not be your allies yet. Sometimes you need to talk to the big employers round about where you are, because that's a big challenge too, is to be involved with the bigger companies and employers in the world, and to go step by step. I mean, because I've put memorials to conference for the Methodist Church to try to reduce their divest Methodist funds from fossil fuels, and that took quite a fight, and a few of us went down to meet with JPIT, the Joint Advisory Committee on Ethical Investment, and eventually we got to meet with them, and they heard our voice, and eventually they gave the recommendation on to the CFB, Central Finance Board, they should divest. So it's some of it is slogging, actually. It's just being persistent and keep talking to people in a friendly way. I think I'm aware, having made my talk, that there was a bit of interesting contradiction within it. I was saying it's the coalition of coalitions. Everybody is our friend, but also you need to engage creatively with people who are not yet your friend. So find how SO and BP can become sustainable energy companies.
Thank you. We've actually got a question from David that kind of links in with that. How can activists counter the power and influence of the fossil fuel lobby? They seem on the inside with government and Extinction Rebellion on the outside, whatever the strengths of the argument. If that question makes sense, I think I was watching a TV programme last night with Joe Lycett, who did a whole programme about Shell and their greenwashing activities. And I think what I got from that programme was that it's tremendously hard to engage with some of these big companies. So David is asking how can we counter the power and influence of the powerful fossil fuel lobby? I don't know if either of you have any thoughts. We have actually only got a couple of minutes, really, so I don't know if that's tackleable. Hannah, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, Noel might have others. I think it's important to recognise that they're not necessarily as far away as we might think. That as shareholders, as stakeholders, we hold a lot of power. So it might not be necessarily through the methods that people are used to using for activism. So our default might be write to our MP or kind of sign a letter. But actually, are we prepared to go to the AGM of our pension holder or of our bank and raise a question? Are we prepared to join with others around kind of using that lobbying power? So there are some really good initiatives that often help that. I think people, Noel might have some recommendations as well. The Ecumenical Council for Corporate Responsibility, or ECCR, often raise questions like that. How can we use our power as stakeholders and shareholders for influence? And Noel's example of somebody like the CFB, who hold the funding for the Methodist Church, are a really good example, again, of a bigger body who they're accountable to the Methodist Church as Methodist members. We have a voice in that space, but they hold a lot of influencing power through the funding that they control for the Methodist Church. So actually, we have to just look at our spheres of influence and go, actually, we're not as many steps removed from those spaces as we think we might be, and think about how we can use our power in that sense.
Thank you. That's really useful.
Not very much more. Only to kind of reiterate that, really, that I think question about whether you should carry on being invested or divest. The argument for carrying on having investment is that you can still engage with them, and once you're outside, then you cannot. The argument was that at the moment, there seems to me to be more power in withdrawing your money. It's a bigger threat, really, ultimately, or a bigger inducement to the companies to change is actually to withdraw your money. And CFB and Jackie made that decision in the end because they were convinced through working with Operation Noah as well, they were not aligned to Paris. They were not aligned to the Paris Accord. And therefore, as people of conscience, we could no longer hold investments with them. There is a time for engagement and a time for coming out and saying why you've come out. Maybe, yes, later, go back in. Not to say that you're forever banning yourself from particular organisations. So yes, the in and out is a difficult question, I think.
Thank you. That's incredibly helpful in helping us all think about actually what our spheres of influence are. And I think that's a sentence that a phrase that I'm going to take away from this. We are coming to the end of our time, but there's just one small question that's come up in the Q&A about doing an eco-church survey. And somebody who is anonymous has asked how you might do an eco-church survey and where they might find a document that might help them do it. Noel, I wonder if you might be able to help with that.
Yes, well, I'll go on to Google or your browser and search Arosha,
yes,
one word, R-O-C-H-A, Arosha. Probably the link is there, Eco Church Arosha. You click on that and you will see, you'll need to gather 2 or 3 people together, aside a couple of hours, ideally with somebody involved with your property and your finance together, because I'll ask you some questions and you can fill it in as you go. It will take a little while to do it. You do it online, and in doing the questions, it will prompt you to think, oh, I could do that. Well, no, I couldn't do that yet, and that's fine. There'll be 20 things you can't do yet, but there'll be 3 that you can.
Fantastic, thank you so much. I think that we're going to draw that time of questions to an end now. I can't believe that we've actually been together for an hour. It seems to have gone very, very quickly. On behalf of John Wesley's New Room and the Learning Network, a huge thank you, Hannah and Noel, for helping us reflect on this very challenging issue. Now that it's been recorded, this talk is going to be prepared and placed as a digital download in the New Room's online shop. So if you know anybody who wasn't able to come tonight and would still like to listen to the talk or to engage with the talk, then in a couple of days it will be available to buy as a download, and then you can pass it to other people to watch as well. There's just a couple of, as always, final notices before we wrap up. We are planning some more WES talks, but actually we'd like to know what sort of subjects you'd like us to feature. So hopefully my email is going to come up in the chat, and I was hoping if you are an attendee, if you could email me and let me know if you have any ideas of issues or interesting topics that you would like WES Talk to cover. We've done quite a few in our year together so far, and we want to do some more. But actually, we want to find out a little bit more about what our attendees think as well. There's also a chance to sign up to John Wesley's New Room newsletter to find out about forthcoming events. We are starting to hold events on site as well as events online. So if you would like to sign up, then please go to our website, newroombristol.org.uk, and you can sign up to our newsletter. Thank you once again to everyone who has come along this evening, and thank you to Hannah and to Noel. Attendees, this is the end of the WES talk, so please could you click leave now, and I'll ask our speakers just to stay with us for a moment. Thank you very much, everyone.